The next chapter in Soc 1000, of course, is social structure. That's chapter 4. We've talked a little bit about this already and talked about how it's made up of certain components that occur in all social groups across the world. The big questions in this chapter include: what is social structure? How do social hierarchies shape our lives and life choices and relationships? Why do institutions influence social life? How is social structure linked to social interaction? And finally, why are social structures so slow to change? Well, social structures are made up of two important components. They include social hierarchies, which are found in every society and of groups of people. And in the hierarchies, some are elevated more than others are. So in the social hierarchy of a family, parents are at a different level than their children are. In some cultures, grandparents and more distant relatives are even at a higher level. It also includes institutional environments made up of laws, rules, organizations, and the government in which individuals navigate. So we must follow these rules in organized societies. If you're in the military, you have social hierarchy made up of from privates to generals, and there are rules that govern how people interact and coordinate with one another within that institution. The second question has to do with: how do social hierarchies shape our lives, especially the choices we make in our relationships? Two critical reasons there are several critical reasons why social hierarchies are an important component of social structure. And one of them has to do with its impact on our lives and life choices. Life chances refer to the things that we have opportunities to do based on where we stand in society. So if you're in the upper class, speaking of, for example, taking a vacation this summer, you may have a plethora of choices to pick from, whether it's a world tour or a tour of Europe, or perhaps going to Machu Picchu. If you're in the lower class, it may be a very different choice. It applies to where you live at, the type of car you drive, or if you even drive a car, maybe you have someone drive it for you, where you go to college at, where you buy your groceries at. So your social standing makes all the difference in the world on life choices, including and life chances, including where you get your health care from. Hierarchies also shape our lives and relationships in many other ways, including who we have relationships with. So social hierarchies, society as a whole is impacted by hierarchies. They generate tensions and conflicts, sounds like conflict theory to me, between dominant and subordinate groups. As Marx called them, the haves and the have-nots. Some of these groups might include wealthy people versus poor people, Republicans versus Democrats, the heterosexual or heteronormative versus homonormative or homosexuals. There's always a tension between people in power and people that don't have power. Power and privilege also occur in hierarchies. So the dominant group monopolizes the opportunities or the claims that they make on rewards. They keep themselves in power. It's ironic that the United States Congress is made up mostly of attorneys, people that run for office who have law degrees. What do you suppose the likelihood of someone who's an attorney in the Senate or the House for that matter, uh, seeking to change laws on your behalf as opposed to their behalf. I'm not saying all of them do that, but that may be part of the reason that things don't change. Subordinate groups, on the other hand, have inferior status and they have limited opportunities. Imagine running for a public office against someone who is a wealthy millionaire or billionaire like Michael Bloomberg versus someone who just decides they want to run because they feel compelled and called to be part of a public office. Money does talk. One of the things that happens because of this power differential is discrimination. So discrimination happens because of the power imbalance. Powerful people influence the behavior of others, including establishing of laws, like congressmen do, that exclude subordinate groups and reproduce the power inequality. An example might be Congress or representatives in a local area having polling places that are inaccessible to people that are poor. They decide where the polling places are and they do everything they can to maintain the subordinate group in a subordinate position. There were challenges to discrimination, including the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, the women's rights movement, which has been going on even longer than that. Some people trace it back to before the American Civil War, and even legal and political changes, including the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Political challenges also occurred with women's right to vote back in the early 1900s. Imagine being a woman who was unable to vote, even though by law you still have all the rights that men do, except the right to vote. Well, that's, of course, changed. An example of how demographics change includes trends in agricultural production. The chart on the right of the diagram shows how the percentage of males in agriculture has declined since the 1850s to the 2000s very dramatically, the percentage of people. Part of this is due to more opportunities to work off the farm, and especially because of the advent of technology. But the critical trends in employment for males is very different than it is for females in agricultural jobs, which basically haven't changed much at all. You do notice that agriculture for women actually has a couple of bumps in it. One that was around the American Civil War and one that was between World War I and World War II. It's even true about manufacturing jobs. So at the end of the Civil War to the 1960s, there was a tremendous growth in the United States. By the early 20th century, immigration kept occurring, and it not only paved the way, literally, for the development of urban areas, but it included the creation of entire communities. All one has to do is drive around Chicago, and you can see a multitude of different ethnic neighborhoods, some of them still there. By the 2000s, though, manufacturing jobs started to disappear because technology replaced manual labor with technologically driven labor like robots. So education seems to have an important role in this. Find the right. Include organized religion, the schools and educational systems, and the marriage system. One thing about institutions in their very nature is that they change very slowly. If you look at organized religion around the United States, attendance at religion has slowly been tapering off, which isn't something that's just notable in the United States. It happens all over all over Europe, and we're maybe a half a century behind most of Europe. Even schools and educational systems are enduring institutions. Have you ever wondered why students are off between May and the fall, August? It may have something to do with back 100 years ago, labor was needed on the farm during planting and harvesting. But as we saw in the one chart, most people don't live on farms anymore. Even the marriage system is slow to change, including property and legal rights between men and women, and even today, by today's standards, the advent of gay marriage. Within the government, there are important institutions as well, including schools, economic institutions of society like banking, the stock market, um, uh, and federal regulatory agencies, and including religion. Remember, institutions don't change very quickly, and they have predictable rules within the hierarchy. And this includes the legal system as well. The legal system not just including judges and courts, but includes the law enforcement system, the prison system, etc. We need to know that the laws apply to everyone, and that the legal system is there in case we need it. They stand above other institutions in society because they provide predictability, and they serve as the ultimate expression of power of these institutions. They provide policies and programs related to social insurance and social assistance like Medicare and Medicaid. One of the criticisms that has come out with this whole coronavirus issue is the fact that there weren't policies in place, or for that matter, departments in place that were disbanded a couple of years ago to provide surveillance and program assistance to react to crises like this. So that institution of government affiliated with the CDC and federal government to respond to this crisis, it just isn't there. And what we've discovered is that local governments, like state and instead of federal, are leading the way to provide health care and assistance for citizens. The fourth question is, how is social structure linked to social interactions? It can be summarized by the saying, birds of a feather flock together. Individuals define themselves through identification in the rules, roles, and social norms that we have in our social interactions. Roles include behaviors that are expected in certain roles, like being a parent or being a student, and social norms define what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. How does social structures create norms and roles? Well, they do that because they're reinforced over and over again. So social structures reward and reinforce appropriate role and normative behavior. And this process of socialization into these roles and norms happens throughout the lifespan. Parents, of course, being the primary people, as we discovered in the last chapter, that teach and train us how to be members of society and how to adapt to different social settings. It's not just parents, of course, as we learned. It's other family members, it's the media, it's our educational system, and what, remember, George Herbert Mead called significant and generalized others. Some features of the socialization process include games and role playing in early childhood, perhaps maybe even more important in some ways than learning about academics. Structured learning environments that happen in late childhood and adolescence, like middle school athletics and high school athletics. and of course learning how to adapt to new situations and guidelines throughout adulthood and the rest of your life. Think of the first time you had a job and how you were socialized into your job. People that worked there showed you the ropes. You found out who to ask if you had questions, who had the power in an institution. So the socialization process really never ends. Bourdieu believed that we developed habits. He called them habitus, that specifically examine how different economic and social group, or what he called classes, teach their members different ways of living. So if you're in the middle class, there are certain habits that you perform as opposed to being in the lower class. And we tend to hang on to those habiti very dear, which makes one wonder about the difference between social structure and individual choice. Are we an agent of free will? Do we have agency where people in society are responsible because they act in a free way and make their lives what they want? Or are we sort of driven and have little agency or lack the capacity to make free choices? And this is an age-old question. I hear it all the time when students talk about voting. Some say it's all rigged. My voice means nothing. So they don't believe they have agency, whereas others take the bull by the horns and decide that in spite of not having much of an impact, they still want to have some impact. Social structures slow to change? Well, because they need to be what's called path dependent. We need social structures to be predictable. We're all familiar with the keyboard on your computer or on your telephone. Imagine what would happen if suddenly Apple or some other phone manufacturer or computer manufacturer rearranged the keys on a keyboard. It would cause all kinds of problems. So we know that when we buy a new phone, we know exactly where the keys are. We know where all the letters will be. So path dependency is pretty important, and it's powerful. I learned how to type on a computer, or actually a typewriter, back in the 1960s, and thank God the keys haven't been moved around because I would be lost. So social structures are really important, and they have some important characteristics. They are persistent over time, and one of the things that they do is they generate their own interest groups. So social structures, if you're a policeman, in the social structure of the legal system, you have a vested interest in all things legal, and you're interested in law and order, that own your own particular interest group. They often garner public support because of the hierarchies and institutions that reinforce them. Nobody particularly wants to interact with the policeman unless you're in trouble or someone violates your rights. So social structures are important because they predict certain outcomes, they generate their own interest, and they persist. Social structures are everywhere. Even where you're sitting right now, you can see the social structures that are important, including the fact that you have power in your house, that you have food in your refrigerator, all provided by social structures, that you know if there's something wrong, you can pick the phone up and call 911. In fact, the fact that you're listening to a lecture is part of a social structure called the educational system. We depend on social structures, and as much as we want them to change, we don't want them to change abruptly, we want them to change slowly. Social structures matter a lot to us. Think of the social structure of family, how important that is to you. And while there may be some negative features, most of the time they have very positive features. Families provide support, emotional support, financial support, and provide for our daily needs. When these social structures fail, sometimes the potential for harm occurs. So while we depend on the police to be honest and protect us, sometimes police don't do that. And when that happens, the outcome is typically very negative.